Hi there, my name is Tristan and I've been using the Mavic Air series since the very first entry, and after the mostly very positive reviews about the Air2s, I bought it on day one and made a direct comparison to my Mavic Air 2. And unfortunately, comparing the overall image quality, I found a lot of stuff that did not improve as much as I expected, and then also quite some things where the old Mavic Air 2 beats the newer model. So in this video I want to really compare image quality in detail, which might be very picky for some, and I do not want to call this a full review. Just get a discussion going, cause while I sure like the Air2s, I think it gets praised a little more than it deserves. And just for context, while I know my way around raw file formats and post-production and would always work in manual as much as possible when it comes to photography, I use my Air mostly for climbing and other active track scenarios where I just don't have the time to control everything in the camera manually. That's why I chose it over the Pro in the first place. Also, please note that I kept the drones on the ground for the direct comparison just to get the shots as close as possible, so composition is not supposed to be pretty for either of the two. Now, comparing the technical abilities of the two cameras is quite tricky because they use slightly different sensor technology. So, most digital cameras use a biofilter mosaic to arrange RGB color filters on their photosensors. If you look at your digital photo, every pixel corresponds to one light sensor on your image sensor, also called pixel. So every pixel can only measure one luminance value, no individual colors. Therefore, the bio pattern places red, green and blue filters over each light sensor, with twice the amount of green sensors because our eyes can differentiate green better. Since we want 3 values for RGB for each pixel, so full color, the missing color information is interpolated, which is where a lot of artifacts come from, like moire. And this applies to the majority of all digital cameras. Now the Mavic Air 2, however, adopted a quad bio color filter array, which keeps the 1x1x2 color array, but doubles the amount of luminance pixels underneath, which in theory quadruples the resolution from 12 to 48 megapixels. However, this cuts pixel sizes in half, and the smaller a sensor gets, the more light it needs or the more noise it creates. Also, 2 neighboring pixels now receive the same color information, which is still more information than before, but not really doubled information. Or to put it another way, since the distance between different color pixels is now relatively higher, there's more information that needs to be interpolated. And that is what you see by eye when you compare the 12 megapixels with the 48 megapixel image. It looks sharper, but it doesn't have 4 times the information. This technique was created by Sony for smartphone sensors to have more room for digital zoom, but honestly it's mostly a marketing trick cause 48 megapixel on a smartphone sounds impressive. However, apart from the high resolution, there's another advantage of the quad bio sensor, and that is HDR. With these 4 luminance sensors per color filter, you can record 4 different sensitivities for each color on the array, creating images with a much higher dynamic range. At the cost of your extra resolution though, that is why the Mavic Air can only shoot either 48 megapixel photos or smart photos, not both combined. And that is also the reason why the Air2s can no longer shoot HDR video and photos, at least in theory. Now, finally comparing just the normal photo mode on both, the Air2s is simply better. It's sharper, has slightly more dynamic range, and the colors look subjectively overall better. When it comes to the 48 megapixel mode on the Mavic Air 2, it was always obvious that it used a lot of filtering tricks to achieve the high resolution, and it also comes at a drop in dynamic range compared to the normal photo mode. But even though I said and still think the 48 megapixels are faked in a way, it overall still captures more fine detail than the Air2s, and I tested this in different situations. You might say that is obvious because 48 is more than 20, but as I explained earlier, it basically used some smartphone magic to fake that, but in the end it is still sharper. But that's not the only surprise. As I just explained, the Air2s should no longer have the HDR functions, and that is why you don't see HDR video anymore. The smart photo mode is still around though, and according to DJI it does some scene analysis, but depending on the scene, and I started in different environments, smart photo on the Air2s does next to nothing, or even absolutely nothing. For comparison, this is the difference on a Mavic Air 2 between normal and smart photo. That is night and day, and was one of my favorite features, which I guess is why they kept the button, hoping I wouldn't notice. Now you could also use the bracketing photo mode to create something similar to these smart photos yourself in post, but the amazing quick and easy HDR photo is gone. So in summary, the Mavic Air 2 can achieve either better sharpness or better dynamic range than the Air2s. And while I would say that the Air2s photos generally look better, I would not say that it is enough to beat its predecessor. But one of the biggest upgrades is the 1-inch sensor, which should increase the low-light performance significantly, and that is what most tests I watched implied. Back to back though, I once again have to say that I'm a bit disappointed. Looking at overall brightness and detail in dark areas, the Air2s is better, but not by a lot. And if we compare sharpness again, here the Mavic Air 2 in 48 megapixel mode, which is supposed to act like 12 megapixel in low light, still keeps up. Now this scene in reality to my eye was already a lot darker than both cameras made it look like. So I took another picture away from the sunset, where it was almost completely dark. And the Air2s looked better, but it's not a massive difference. So I went even darker with barely any light left, and sure, the Air2s is definitely ahead now if you look at the area surrounding the fire, but not as much as I expected from a sensor twice the size. Let's talk about video sharpness and quality next. The new 5.4K is not a common display resolution, so will most likely be either cropped or downsampled. Sharpness-wise, 5.4K downsampled looks slightly sharper than 4K from the Mavic Air 2 in very fine detail areas, but I would say you can't really see it by eye without the direct comparison. But if you already have an Air 2, does downsampling to 4K look better than filming natively in 4K, so you don't always have to film in maximum resolution? The answer is I can see a slight increase in sharpness if I sit directly in front of a 4K TV, but I would say it doesn't matter. So the main reason to film 5.4K would be to zoom in. But can you zoom to 4K without a visual loss in quality? This might seem obvious, but with a lot of cameras, looking at GoPros but also RED cameras, that is not always the case. On the Air 2 though, while native 4K looks just a touch better in comparison, I would not be able to tell the difference in an edit. But what about real zooming? Cropping from 5.4K to 4K gives you a zoom of about 140%, but the Air2s also gives you options for digital 200 and 400% zooms. This is noticeable to the eye. 200 looks processed and sharpened already, while I would call 400% unusable. And here comes another surprise. The Mavic Air 2 also got this digital zoom by software update, and guess what? It looks much better than on the Air2s. You really feel the different FOV here, so the 4x zoom is somewhere between the 2x and 4x zoom on the Air2s, but it looks easily better than both. And lastly, is in-camera zoom really worth it at all? Does it give an advantage over filming in 5.4K and zooming in post? The difference is almost unnoticeable, but zooming in post looks just a touch sharper. So unless you need to save file size, the 5K files are about a third bigger, I would recommend not using the zoom on the Air2s at all. Then there are also the image artifacts. The Air2s has considerably stronger chromatic aberration, stronger and more saturated. It has quite a lot stronger lens distortion, which makes sense for a smaller focal length, but still. And if you compare the noise of the two at ISO 3200, once again it's not the improvement I expected. When it comes to lens flares, the Air2s's flare is much more subtle, which many will like, but I really love the colorful flower-like flares on the Mavic Air 2. But this one might be personal preference. And then there's this, which I do not really understand at this point. But while trying HLG, which stands for Hybrid Log Gamma and is an HDR standard that is now new on the Air2s, I get these strobe effects in the shadows. As this is in direct sun, it should not be a shutter or frame rate issue, and more concerningly, I did not see this on my controller while shooting, which to be fair could be due to the sun, but I will have to investigate more. Another point that probably no one cares about is slow motion. The 1080p 120 FPS still looks as terrible as it always has, which is disappointing. But what I don't get is that the Air2s dropped the 240 FPS mode, which also did not look good, but also did not look any worse than the 120, so why not keep it at least? So I actually have to re-record my final conclusion because I found so many strange things while editing this video. While the tracking with the additional sensors initially impressed me, by now I had a couple of lost tracks that really disappointed me, and I also have seen videos with the Air2s crashing into obstacles when it seems too busy. Image-wise, the camera would be amazing if I did not do the direct comparison, and I think that is the point many reviewers missed. I love that the Air2s adds D-Log and other pro features, and I do not really need the 48 megapixel mode and also not the digital zoom features, but the amazing HDR modes I lose makes it a tough decision. So my initial euphoric impressions changed into the following conclusion. If you were waiting for the Air2s to decide which drone to buy, it's tough. Both drones have their advantages, but the flood of good deals you might now get on the Mavic Air 2 might actually be the better choice for many, because let's face it, while D-Log and the 150 bits offer a lot for people who can work with that kind of footage, the majority of people choosing an Air over a Pro might be more interested in the incredible automatic HDR modes. And when it comes to upgrading, there's definitely still room for discussion, but I personally would have skipped the Air2s and waited for the Air 2 had I known everything I learned in the last week. And this really surprised me. When I started reviewing the Air2s, I expected a very different conclusion. Anyways, if you made different experiences, and I actually hope you did and I missed something here, please let me know. Thanks for watching and goodbye.